Hi there, I'm Lucinda Rumsey. I'm an English tutor at Mansfield and also the tutor of admissions. And I'm going to do a mock interview here with Peter, who's one of my first year students, who's now going to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Peter, like Lucinda said. Yeah, I'm doing English, reading English at Mansfield in Oxford. So yeah, I'm in my first year. Yeah.
So we're going to do what is fairly typical of a English interview. How we select candidates for English is we get a lot of information. So students do the English Literature Aptitude Test, the ELAT. We have the UCAS form, which has got qualifications and predictions and a reference from the teacher, and also students' personal statement. And all of that tells us lots of information about whether, kind of what a student is reading, what they're enjoying, what they like, why they want to do the subject. And then we also ask for a piece of written work. And the interviews, I mean, every college does these things a little bit differently, but the Mansfield interview tends to be one interview which is mostly around a poem. So we might talk for kind of quarter of an hour, 20 minutes about a piece of poetry, and we'll have a big pile of them in the corner and select different ones so that we don't give the same one to every candidate, and they end up having, talking outside the room and telling each other about them. And then we will ask the student to just have 5 minutes to look at it, and then we will go through it just kind of like first impressions. And then we'll talk about some other things in that interview as well, but most of it will be focused around the poem. And the purpose of it is to make sure that candidates can look at something they've not seen before, that they've not prepared for, and just to kind of give them a chance to sort of see how they think and how they talk through something, and also how just they respond in conversation. And some of the things that we're looking for as tutors are, we're looking for kind of flexibility, a kind of willingness to kind of keep trying on a problem when something gets a little bit difficult. So the poem is a really good way of enabling us to do that. So we're just going to start off. Okay, so Peter, I gave you this poem just a little while ahead. I'm going to read it out, but we're also going to push it up on the screen. So it's called The Letter, and we tend not to give the author or a date because that, people might want to guess about that. So The Letter. Little cramped words scrawling all over the paper like draggled flies' legs. What can you tell of the flaring moon through the oak leaves, or of my uncurtained window and the bare floor spattered with moonlight? Your silly quirks and twists have nothing in them of blossoming hawthorns, and this paper is dull, crisp, smooth, virgin of loveliness beneath my hand. I am tired, beloved, of chaffing my heart against the want of you, of squeezing it into little ink drops and posting alone. I scold alone here under the fire of the great moon. Okay, so Pete, tell me what your first thoughts are about this. What struck you about it, first of all?
I really enjoyed this poem. I think the big thing that jumps out to me is its kind of self-awareness as a piece of writing, this kind of meta thing going on, where it's talking about the paper, the act of writing itself, and kind of like the tactile feeling of the paper, the materiality of the paper. And I thought that was really interesting, and kind of also interesting in maybe even now in kind of how we're reading it and how we're experiencing it, because the paper, the poems kind of in different incarnations, and every time we read it, we might read it in a different way. So we're reading it on a screen here, but we might read it on a piece of paper, or it could be on a billboard. And then what does that do to what the poem is saying about paper? And then also what would happen if we were to read it aloud like you did, and that poem wasn't on the screen? So the people experiencing it are only experiencing it orally. That might change kind of what's going on. And almost then we might ask, is that a violation of what that poem's trying to do? But then also just kind of, so I've spoken about it, drawing attention to it kind of physically, but then also formally. It's a poem, like as you've said, and also like as we've read, but it's called The Letter, and it's describing the act of writing a letter, or at least kind of alluding to it. So then that might raise a question it raised a question for me, and I'm still not sure, is this their letter, or is this their poem about writing their letter? So I thought,
that's great, brilliant, yeah, really good. You said that it's kind of, yes, it's either sort of it's either the letter or it's about a letter, and could you sort of start to take that a little bit to bits by thinking, so maybe we can kind of work out a bit more about that. So taking it from the top, as it were, what are the sort of the kinds of things in relation to a letter which the poem is talking about?
So trying to fit all just the first line, trying to fit the words on the page, like scrawling. And then they ask a question: what can you tell of the flaring moon through the oak leaves? Maybe that was them asking themselves, what can I tell? Can I describe this flaring moon through the oak leaves in this letter that I'm writing? Or is that a question that they are actually writing in their letter?
Yeah, that's interesting. Say a bit about the you, because what are the different things that the you could refer to, the sort of addressee, as it were?
Yeah, so the you could be us. What can you tell? Like, what can we tell of the flaring moon? The you could be the person that is being addressed, but also then it like I said, it could be kind of a self-reflexive question, one that they're asking themselves. What can you tell of the flaring moon? But then maybe that interpretation is kind of dampened by the fact, the following line, or of my uncurtained window. So there they seem to be going into making a possessive comment that would make more sense to us, and maybe suggest that they aren't asking themselves questions.
Yeah, and is there if you just took it if you got it as a sentence and it wasn't in poetry, of course, when you finish a line in poetry, it makes you stop and think, well, where's the connection? What is the next line following? So little cramped words scrawling all over the paper like draggled fly slates. What can you tell of the flaring moon? If you just say it as a sentence, there's a kind of different you that it could be addressing. Is there?
Oh yeah, so that's actually really cool. So I suppose it's asking the words themselves what they can tell of the moon, which makes me think then of kind of this like mining of the words for meaning. So the words are just there on the paper, and then they're almost trying to uncover and explore and kind of get to what those words are trying to be, kind of like a sculptor like shaping a piece of stone or something like that.
And is it that's very good. So, and I think, I mean, what's really interesting in what you said is that I think that it is sort of all of those things at once. It's a kind of like, if it's a letter, then it's addressed to somebody, and so when you use a you in a letter, you're sort of saying, dear, whatever. So there is a kind of like, what can you tell? And that may be if I write this, can you see how I feel, or can you see what I see, or whatever. But there's also the kind of a kind of there's broader things there, but also very narrowly, what can the word do, which is meta in another kind of way. It's kind of an idea about what can words do. Could you? I've read this poem loads of times, but I hadn't actually thought about this before. Is there a way you could break it down even smaller than a word? Given that,
well, I guess so. The letter itself.
So then it's kind of it's sort of falling apart now. So you said a really nice image you used of the kind of idea of sort of sculpting a poem. That's kind of interesting, given the sort of that this poem is quite shaped.
The shape.
Is there? And that sounds quite a positive thing. If you had to sort of say what you thought the tone of the poem was, the kind of the voice you would say it in, is it a happy poem? Is it kind of, what kind of spirit is it got?
Seems kind of annoyed a little bit. There seemes to be some tension with whoever is receiving this letter, or whoever they're thinking about writing this letter to, kind of dissatisfaction. And just the fatigue, I am tired. But I was thinking about this kind of things not being fully clear, and that's what seems to be annoying whoever's writing this. So, or of my uncurtained window and the bare floor spattered with with moonlight, kind of
Mm.
I just looking through a window, and like we can only see the bare floor, but you know what is through the window on the other side, and it was making me think about this kind of, maybe it represents a kind of well, this annoyance in the tone represents some kind of friction in their love, which then might parallel this kind of physical friction of the words being written into the paper, the kind of the scrawling, the friction between the pen and the paper. Yeah, there seems to be
Nice.
some kind of disconnect there, even though they're meant to be in love.
Yeah. Yes, there's a kind of the sort of beloved with a capital B is kind of, you know, sort of makes it sound like a very grand. And that line, and this paper is dull, crisp, smooth, virgin of loveliness beneath my hand. Are there different ways that you could read the virgin of loveliness?
Yeah, so the kind of the dull bit suggests that it's plainness. The virgin of loveliness made me think like a virgin page, a fresh page that hasn't yet been written upon. So the dullness is almost presenting that kind of that emptiness as a negative thing. But then loveliness and this kind of obsession, or not obsession, but kind of desire for or affection towards purity, and then also the virgin of loveliness, the kind of connotations of a virgin woman, the Virgin Mary, virginity in general, and that kind of thing. Then maybe that personifies or anthropomorphizes the paper in some way, brings it to life in a way that's kind of ambivalent, because it's dull, but it's also this pure person.
Yes, and I was thinking as the kind of as potentially meaning, so a virgin, it can be a virgin of loveliness, so it's kind of like it's lovely and a virgin, but it can also be lacking in. So the blank sheet, the, you know, kind of, so there is something very you know, potentially for a poet in sitting writing something kind of like challenging but fantastic about a blank page, but also kind of frustrating if you're trying to get a poem out. So that I like that, and it's, you know, that made me think, you saying the thing about the kind of all the different sort of connotations of virgin. What are other bits in other kind of phrases and words in the poem that seem odd to you, odd uses, either thinking about what the kind of conventions of poetry are and what you would expect, but also just that feel like they kind of expresses, I don't know, sort of some uncertainty or kind of just oddness.
I definitely think this kind of the invoking of the moon and the great moon, the fiery moon, it seems really dramatic and cosmic and kind of beautiful, and very cinematic and epic. But then like on the flip side of that is the second line, the draggled fly's legs. Like I don't even know if draggled is a real word, like it might be a made-up word, and this kind of contrast between almost nodding towards this kind of epic, poetic, romantic tradition. You know, writing a letter to your beloved is an extremely romantic kind of thing, and then kind of this crude, ugly, kind of mundane thing going on with the fly's legs, and almost like a battle between what we perceive letter writing to be, which is a big romantic gesture, and then actually the realities of putting pen to page and it being kind of difficult, it being kind of annoying, and also just the fact, the ambivalence in their relationship, the kind of, you're my epic beloved, but then also I'm tired, you know, chafing my heart, kind of like their relationship is, it's not all rosy.
No.
So I thought that was quite interesting.
And there's some very, I really like that, the kind of the sort of the kind of grand to the little, this term bathos, you know, it's kind of like this little sort of mundane thing, and then there's this kind of big B for beloved. There's also these kind, I think these kind of odd things which are, so you expect the moon to appear in a love poem, but you don't expect to be scolded by it, you don't expect to be burnt by it, and also kind of there's some really odd liquid images, I think, in this poem, you know, kind of the spattered with moonlight, and the kind of draggled, the idea of being damp, and then this idea of sort of the light of the moon sort of burning you like hot water. It's a very, is there anything in that you could think of in relation to the idea of the poet frustrated with her, kind of, with her productive capacity or whatever?
Yeah, it seems kind of, well, it just makes me think of like bodily things, like somatic, like spitting, sunburn,
Yeah,
getting
yeah,
wet in the rain,
yeah,
all things that are kind of, annoying for our bodies, and also kind of, I guess it just goes back to what I was saying earlier about unpolished, kind of the high and the low, but maybe then it has again to do with kind of the writing process, the spattered. I know it's the moonlight is spattering,
yeah,
but the kind of dampening of the page, almost the spitting of words onto the page, or in this case, the burning of words onto the page, the scalding of them. And then also just makes me think that the moon bit specifically, kind of, meeting a lover at midnight under the moon on a hill, except they've been waiting for so long that they've got sunburn or moonburn, and they're kind of annoyed. They're like, oh, why haven't you turned up? Like, I've been waiting here for hours. Like, just kind of like inconvenient, like little annoying things. Like, I'm not sure.
Which is nice, and that kind of goes very nicely with the idea of the kind of creative process that it's kind of the wrong word. Somehow it's the wrong word. That kind of, so the creating the letter or creating the love poem, you're not always, it's about redrafting or something, and you kind of keep getting it wrong. No, spat is the wrong word, but I read this poem online once when I was sort of looking for a version. I couldn't find my copy of it, and somebody had misprinted it, and it was not uncurtained but uncertain. My uncertain window. And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
That's really cool.
Kind of, it was a little redraft, by kind of an online redraft. Is this like any other poem that you've ever read, or does it remind you of anything, or does it feel different?
Kind of. I mean, it's not the same formally, but I think it does the same thing. Like we've been just talking about, the annoyingness, the kind of capturing like big, massive emotions, the big and the high and the low. It makes me think of like haiku poetry, where you just literally have 2 lines or something, and it would be really, really short. And I mean, this poem in the grand scheme of things is quite short for a poem that packs so much in, and just kind of capturing in a really, really small piece of writing these really, really quite complex and quite emotion heavy feelings, emotion heavy kind of ideas and that kind of thing. So it made me think of that. And then I just think, I think it's called concrete poetry or something like that. I'm not sure. But I was thinking
about shape. About
shape, because the draggled fly legs are kind of, I'm just thinking textually, that first kind of stanza, the pulled lines between every other line is kind of pulled out, kind of straggly. Almost like the teared edge of a piece of paper, where some of the bits kind of come away bigger than others. So I think there seems to be, or at least in my reading of it, a kind of awareness and a consciousness of how this is going to look on a piece of paper or on a street, how it's going to be set out, which makes me think of that concrete kind of thing.
I think maybe one could think about that as well, of the kind of the gap between the 2 stanzas, because they're kind of uneven. There's not rhyme, kind of it's sort of doing some things which are like some things you expect from poetry and some not. And one way one might think about that in relation to those 2 stanzas might be that the second stanza is the letter or the love poem, and the first stanza is the kind of build up. You suddenly get the you is possibly different in that second stanza, but all those things about shape make you sort of hyper aware of kind of like trying to work out what's going on with the shape of it. That's really good. Brilliant. Okay, the poem now, and just finish off. So for audiences watching this, that was a fantastic performance. So that was a really good interview. I suppose the sorts of things I was looking for were, so often when candidates look at this poem, they very quickly say, oh, it's this. So if I ask what the you is, they immediately say, oh, the you is the lover. And one of the really good things about what Peter did was kind of like, well, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. And then when I asked another question about something else, it might be saying, oh yeah, no, and it could be that. So there's this sort of the flexibility of taking a bit of more information on board and running with it. The ability, we often ask for, I almost always say this in relation to interviews. The question I ask most often in interviews is, can you give me an example of that? And one of the things that Peter was doing very quickly was moving from kind of saying quite big things about the poem into saying quite precise things and picking up an individual word, and very quickly running with kind of then what was coming out of individual words. So all of those suggest a kind of ability to kind of analyze things, to be flexible about it, to take on new evidence, to be kind of clear thinking about it, and sort of ready to rethink. And so those are kind of, that basically is just me running through pretty much the criteria. So Peter gets a big tick from that interview. So how was it, Peter, in comparison with your own experience of, unless you've forgotten all of that?
Yeah, it was really good. It was so I had 2 interviews. My first one was more to do with my personal statement and my A-levels and things that I'd been reading to do with my course. And then my second one was just like this. It was like reading a poem that I'd just seen literally probably like 10 minutes before the interview. It was quite similar. It kind of, what I really liked about, I don't remember a lot, but what I remember about the interview where we spoke about, we did a kind of close reading like this, was the bouncing back and forth of ideas, and the kind of, I really enjoyed it because it became kind of almost a creative process where we were like making bits of the poem ourselves, kind of running with stories, which I felt like when we were talking about the lover's annoyance and kind of that kind of the drama of the moon, but also them kind of not getting on. I think that was really nice because it felt like we almost had then a rapport about the poem and kind of, and that's what I remember from that interview. But yeah, pretty similar. I don't think I would have said things in such depth.
No.
I don't think I would have been able to do all of that. I was pretty nervous, so I don't think. But my first interview, which I do remember probably a lot, like I remember more because we were talking about things that I'd written on my personal statement for the UCAS form, and so we spoke about Othello, which I was studying at A-level. And I knew the play well, but one of the tutors kind of pulled me up on a little section which I'd just never thought about before, and I struggled with it for like probably like 3 or 4 minutes, like a little bit of an awkward silence, and then I kind of had a eureka moment, and that was really, really nice because I was learning new things about the texts that I'd been studying myself. So it was kind of nice to go somewhere familiar, but also get to have a new experience with a text that I was familiar with. And then, as Lucinda said, we also kind of spoke about my written work for a bit, and that was really interesting as well because I was grounded in something that I was familiar with, but also asked some really quite interesting, challenging questions. So it was positive.
Brilliant. And it was, because Peter's here. I like that you said you were more coherent, you know more now because of education for a year. Doing English.
It's a good thing.
You've read a lot more.
Yeah.
But I think and I think that's exactly right. I mean, the idea, often people think that interviews are sort of us firing questions and either one gets the answer or one doesn't. But actually, I think a lot of what's going on in interviews is kind of seeing whether one can have a kind of conversation which is a bit like a tutorial, however nervous somebody is or quiet somebody is, whether you can have a conversation and you can kind of build on what the other person has said, and that's really important, I think. So that was our interview. Thank you so much, Peter, for going through it again.
Thank you.
And if you have questions about the English interviews or any interviews, then get in touch with us and read the poem and look it up. If you're interested in applying for English, it's a great poem. And every time I read it, something different comes out of it. So that's what we try to find for students to look at in the interview. Good luck in your applications, everybody. And thank you, Peter.